We all understand that the life of an Imperial Guardsman is terrible. You are a simple human being launched into a battlefield filled with greenskins the size of Shaq, Dark Eldar raiders more sadistic than a 70-year-old Catholic priest, and acid-spitting tyrannids. So it becomes the duty of the Astra Militarum to mentally and physically prepare the soldiers of the Imperium on how to face such devastating enemies. The most relied upon method has always been the terror instilled into a guardsman by their commissar. But before a soldier is conditioned to fear the sight of a commissar's cap over the size of a charging orc, they are primed with the knowledge of how to survive on the field of battle. From a detailed guide of the enemies they will face to the function and proper maintenance of their weapons and war gear, all of this information comes in the Imperial Infantryman's Uplifting Primer, a standard issue Imperial document and the topic of today's video. And with all that said, I want to welcome you guys back to another episode of 40 Facts About the 40K Universe. If you're new to the channel, allow me to introduce myself. I am your host, Gersh1, your guide through the grimdark universe of Warhammer 40,000. If you want to learn more, I encourage you guys to subscribe and check out our lore playlists, especially the ones on the topic of the Imperial Guard. And if you like this style of content, please smash the like button. It helps bring this video to more 40K fans. With all that said, let's jump into 40 facts and lore on the Imperial Infantryman's Uplifting Primer. Upon recruitment to the Imperial Guard, each soldier is handed their very own primer. The naive guardsmen take this small black book and are instructed to absorb every detail possible. They are warned that no soldier should ever be found without possession of this primer, and if the field guide is lost, the punishment will be severe. Now, depending on the regiment and the theater of war, the content and organization of the book varies. The Astra Militarum tries its best to standardize the material, but there is no way to create a guide that fits all of the unique experiences our guardsmen will face. The more specialized the role, the more advanced and detailed the primer becomes. For the most part, the first section of these books contains a foreword, explaining the content and how best to use it. This is written by a high-ranking member of the Adeptus Administratum or a senior Imperial Guard officer. The guardsman is given the same instructions as before. Read and memorize the details of this guide. This section tries to highlight the value of the primer and the importance of adherence to its text. To drive the message home, the following pages are a series of forms that are to be filled out by the soldier with their personal information and, more importantly, instructions on who to notify in case of the guardsman's death. This usually shocks the soldier into coming to terms with the reality that death will more than likely be the outcome if they deviate from the instructions of the primer. Now, the first chapter of most primers is a long rule set that each guardsman is to adhere to at all times. It usually lays out strict orders on everyday situations that are specific to their theater of war. It details all of the duties of a guardsman, from the importance of maintaining proper sanitary conditions like waste disposal, vermin control, and water supply, to how often each guardsman should be praying and venerating the God Emperor. The not-so-subtle propaganda jumps out right away. The first chapter makes sure to drive home the message that each action, even simple guard duty, is crucial to mankind's manifest destiny. In other words, each guardsman is contributing to the Imperium's continued rule over the Milky Way galaxy. These requirements are to be abided by at all times, and ignorance of them is not considered a valid excuse, since every soldier is expected to have read the primer and keep it on his or her person at all times. The second chapter of the primer is a lengthy section that describes all of the war gear issued to a guardsman upon their induction into the Imperial Guard. It goes into detail on how to correctly use each item and how to maintain it under the conditions that are specific to their theater of war. Special attention and extra information are provided in the lasgun paragraph, the auto pistol paragraph, the frag grenade paragraph, and the rebreather paragraph, as those are the most vital pieces of equipment to a guardsman. At the end of the chapter is a short description of additional, more specialized war gear a guardsman might request or be issued for special assignment, with a clear warning that training for such gear will only be given when the situation requires it, hopefully not too late. The third chapter is a very lengthy section that contains a comprehensive schematic of the descriptions of the Astra Militarum's chain of command. It includes multiple ranks and those that are external, such as commissars, engineers, and priests of the Adeptus Ministorum. Basically people that a guardsman might encounter in the course of his service, as well as the proper behavior when encountering such personnel, many of who will technically rank senior to most enlisted guardsmen. There then follows a section describing the organization of the standard Astra Militarum company. After the command structure portion, the chapter moves on to the very thorough explanations of how to deal with the many different situations a guardsman will encounter during his or her career. This is one of the most important and useful things in the entire primer. It is divided into many different sections and covers many different topics, but almost always starts off with instructions on how to navigate on the field of battle. This takes the form of map reading and compass calibrating, but also how to find their way to a designated location when they are left with no directional tools. Another very important section that piggybacks off the navigation is survival techniques, where the guardsman is given a series of survival tips to make it on their own or in case of delayed resupply. They are told where to look for water, depending on the environment, and standard hunting procedures. There is also a section that details what a guardsman should do if they find themselves cut off from their unit and behind enemy lines. They will be giving a brief but resourceful section of movement and cover both in and out of combat. This gives them all the possible terrain that they might encounter on a specific theater of war. And then there's a section that is dedicated to anti-aircraft security and protection, which basically reminds the guardsman to always remain vigilant and to stay motionless if an aircraft is spotted. He is warned to get into cover if at all possible when facing airstrikes or any type of airborne enemy. There is a very similar section that describes what to do if enemy armor is spotted. Basically, any anti-tank section that details the use of trenches, foxholes, or natural obstacles as cover. A soldier is reminded that they stand no chance against a tank and to let the heavy weapon squad deal with the threat. Only if the tank gets too close must a regular guardsman expose themselves to fire on its vision slits and make use of armor-piercing crack grenades if possible. And then there's a section on protecting oneself from gas, chemical, or biochemical threats. This section describes the physical symptoms to look out for in the event of the use of chemical or biological weapons by the foe, and reminds the guardsmen to call out an alarm before putting their rebreather, and never remove it if not cleared by a superior officer. They are also given detailed instructions on column movements, in other words, how to lead a marching column if the soldier is unlucky enough to be chosen as the head of the unit. Also a section instructing the guardsmen on how to link elements between different marching columns. Guardsmen will also be given step-by-step instructions on common battlefield scenarios like how to properly set up successful ambushes and how to storm a room. The entire section is dedicated to close-quarter fighting, as well as moving in and out of city blocks. A very crucial section is saved at the end of the book, where the soldier is given details on all additional duties that must be performed during warp transit. This portion is mainly designed to remind the guardsmen to remain watchful of warp psychosis, and to be extra mindful of discipline, as the enclosed environments of a void ship is hard on one's temper and nerves. Now we move on to the fourth chapter, which usually gives out brief explanations on the most common vehicles used by the Astra Militarum. As a guardsman, the chances of your regiment coming into contact with other regiments is fairly high, and so recognizing friendly armored companies as opposed to enemy tanks is crucial. That is why, along with descriptions of Imperial tanks, common Orc and Eldar vehicles are also described. There are brief explanations on how to identify weak spots on these types of enemy armored vehicles. The following chapter is almost always on the topic of alien enemies. There are usually lengthy descriptions of Orcs, Eldar, Tau, and Tyranids, as well as smaller paragraphs on less common but equally deadly Xenos like the Hrud, Slann, and the Rakghoul. Depending on the theater of war, some of these species will not be included. For example, in the Eastern Fringe, the primer goes into detail on the Tau and the Crude, two Xeno species that are not included in the primers of other segmentums. The final full chapter is usually a very basic medical field guide. It covers the general description of the human body and the methods to deal with the types of injuries commonly encountered on the battlefield. Methods of field triage and moving wounded comrades are described in detail, and a list with the necessary medications for the most common afflictions are here. There is almost always a small section at the back called the Crimson Pages that includes all of the primary benedictions of the God Emperor. Litanies, prayers, inspirational quotes, and uplifting creeds used by the Adeptus Ministorum. It also includes Adeptus Mechanicus prescribed litanies to replace the machine spirit of guardsmen's war gear when using it on the field and when performing routine maintenance tasks. Now that we know the contents of the primer, it's important to note that although it's filled with tons of information, the majority of guardsmen hate the book. Veterans look down upon the contents of the primer because they see through the Imperial propaganda, exaggerations of Imperial strength, and the outright lies found within the book. This sentiment has led many regiments to refer to the primer as toilet paper. They are infuriated that the primer minimizes the threat of the enemy, and it mentions nothing of the threat of chaos. For example, the Gene Stealer is described as a weak, slow, and sluggish beast, a blatant lie. A guardsman stands no chance against a charging Gene Stealer. But despite this, the primer provides quick references, solid descriptions, and numerous passages that are useful advice. It has saved the lives of many guardsmen since it was first issued many standard centuries ago. And that's the lore on training for the Imperial Guard. I appreciate you guys listening. But with all that said, this was Gersh1 with One Mind Syndicate signing out.
Oh, if you could put my freedom back in